So, when does something you say at work, a confession even, become legal grounds for firing you? Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating labor case from the Philippines that gets right to the heart of that question. It's a story about alleged theft, a confession that's hotly debated, and a court ruling that draws a super important line between your rights in a police station and your rights in your boss's office. Okay, so to really get our heads around the court's final decision, we're going to walk through this exactly how the case unfolded. We'll kick things off with the accusation itself, then we'll zero in on that controversial confession. After that, we'll unpack the two critical legal tests the court used, which, ultimately led to the final verdict. So let's set the scene. We're at NC Construction Supply. It all starts with a pretty routine incident involving a couple rolls of electrical wire, but it sets off a chain reaction that spirals all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, what's really wild here is the timeline. I mean, look how fast this all went down. An accusation is made on a Saturday. By Monday, the employees are at a police station. And by Tuesday, they've all resigned. But then, just over a month later, they turn around and file a lawsuit, saying they were illegally fired. This super fast escalation is really the key to the whole case. The entire case pretty much hinges on what happened at that police station. The company's story is that the employees confessed and quit on their own. The employees' story, that they were forced to. So let's take a look at the actual evidence. This right here is from one of those handwritten resignation letters. It's a pretty powerful statement, you got to admit. He literally admits to their masama namin gawin, which means our wrongdoing. At first glance, this looks like a slam dunk, right? An open and shut admission of guilt? But then you see this letter from another employee, and things get a little murky. He wrote, "Nakikisama lang ako kahit labag man sa aking kalooban," which means, I was just going along with them, even if it was against my will. Now, this little phrase, it hints at the whole foundation of their later argument, that they were pressured into it.
And there it is. That's their counterclaim. The employees argued that everything they said, everything they wrote down at the police station, was forced out of them. They basically said, hey, none of that counts because we were threatened and intimidated.
So all of this brings us to the first major hurdle you have to clear for any dismissal in the Philippines. Was there a legitimate, valid reason for it? In legal terms, this is what's known as the just cause requirement. So this was the first big question for the court. Based on everything, the letters, the coworker's statement, did NC Construction Supply have a legally solid reason, a just cause, to fire these employees for essentially breaking their trust? Now, the legal standard here is so important to understand. The company didn't have to prove the theft beyond a reasonable doubt like you see in a criminal trial on TV. For a labor case like this, all they needed was substantial evidence, which basically just means enough proof that a reasonable person would look at it and say, yeah, that supports the company's conclusion. And this slide just lays out the court's dilemma perfectly. On one side, you've got the employer with some pretty direct evidence, a coworker pointing fingers, and of course the employee's own signed admissions. On the other side, you have the employees making this really serious claim of coercion. But, and this is a huge but, the court records show they didn't bring any evidence to back that claim up. But here's the thing about labor law. Having a valid reason to fire someone is only half the battle. The employer also has to follow the correct procedure, play by the rules. And that brings us to the second critical test the court had to apply: due process. So the next big question becomes, okay, even if they had a reason, did NC Construction Supply actually follow the legally required steps when they dismissed these workers? Philippine labor law is super specific about this. An employer has to give two separate written notices. The first one basically says, here's what you're accused of, now is your chance to explain your side. And the second notice, well, that comes later, after they've considered that explanation, and it communicates the final decision. And right here, this is where the company just totally dropped the ball. The court looked at the facts and found that the employees were fired pretty much on the spot, right after that investigation at the police station. They never got that first notice with a chance to explain, and they definitely never got a final, second notice of termination. Okay, so now we have this really interesting situation. The company had a valid reason to fire the employees, but they completely failed to follow the proper procedure. So how in the world did the court untangle this mess? All right, we've arrived at the absolute core of the court's final decision, and it all boils down to this really critical distinction. See, the employees argued their confession shouldn't count because they didn't have a lawyer, but the court said, hold on. That right to a lawyer kicks in during a custodial investigation, when the police have you in custody for a crime. This, the court decided, was just an administrative investigation run by an employer. And that right there was the nail in the coffin for the employee's biggest argument. The court basically said since this was a company internal matter, not a police interrogation for a crime, the constitutional right to a lawyer just didn't apply. The fact that it all went down at a police station was just a detail, so their admissions totally valid as evidence. So if you were keeping score at home, this is what the final scorecard looks like. On the just cause test, did they have a valid reason? The employer gets a yes. But on the due process test, did they follow the right procedure? That's a big no. And so the final ruling kind of split the difference. Because there was a valid reason to fire them, that loss of trust, backed up by their own admissions, the termination itself was upheld. It was legal. But for messing up the procedure, for not following the two-notice rule, the company had to pay a penalty, an indemnity of 1,000 pesos to each of the former employees. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, this case establishes a really clear legal principle. An admission you make to your employer during an internal investigation can absolutely be used to fire you, even if you don't have a lawyer sitting next to you. It's a powerful reminder of that fine line between a criminal investigation and a workplace dispute. And it leaves us with a really crucial question. In a situation like this, where exactly does an employee's protection begin and end?